Welcome back to Lore at Night, where rain gently falls and every story carries a shadow. I'm always curious to hear where in the world you're listening from, so comment that down below. Now get comfortable, and let's begin with the first story. The motel room door had been kicked in hard enough to split the frame, not once, but twice. The wood around the lock was crushed inward, fibers peeled back like torn skin. It was the kind of damage that came from certainty rather than haste. Whoever entered had known exactly what they were there to do. Inside, the violence was unmistakable. The bed had been flipped onto its side. One nightstand was broken clean through. The cheap particle board snapped, as if tested for weakness and found wanting. A lamp lay in pieces near the window, its cord torn from the wall. Blood marked the carpet in heavy streaks, dragged rather than spilled, tracking from the center of the room toward the bathroom, as if someone had tried, briefly and unsuccessfully, to get away. Jacob Love was found where the trail ended. He lay partly in the bathtub, his back pressed against the porcelain, his legs twisted outward on the tile. His face was swollen beyond recognition, the skin split in two places along the cheekbone and jaw. One hand was clenched around nothing, the knuckles broken and slick with blood. The injuries were layered, bruises beneath bruises, cuts over swelling. His ribs showed the deep collapse that came from repeated kicks, delivered with time to reset and strike again. This had not been an argument. It had been punishment. The motel sat 20 miles east of Kingman, Arizona, a low strip of rooms crouched beside the highway. People stayed there when they did not want questions, or when they wanted to be gone again before morning. The clerk had been asleep in the back office when the attack happened. The television on low, the sound of passing trucks covering anything else. The first deputy on scene noticed the smell before anything else. Sweat, copper, and the faint sharpness of adrenaline that lingered in closed spaces after violence burned itself out. There were no shell casings, no knives left behind. Whatever had been used was carried in and carried out, or had been nothing more than hands, boots, and intent. Jacob Love was 34 years old. His driver's license listed an address in Flagstaff, though the apartment manager there would later say he had moved out months earlier without notice. His wallet was still on him, cash untouched. His phone was missing. That detail mattered. Detective Aaron Cole arrived just after sunrise. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside, letting the room tell its story without interruption. The damage followed a logic. Entry was forced fast. Control was established immediately. The struggle moved inward, not outward. Love had not been chased. He had been overwhelmed where he stood. Cole noted the absence of defensive chaos. No blood on the walls. No broken glass except the lamp. Love had not been swinging wildly. He had been trying to protect himself, curling inward, absorbing blows until his body stopped cooperating. The bathroom told the final chapter. The tub curtain was ripped down, the metal rod bent. A footprint marked the inside of the tub, heel heavy, toe angled forward. Someone had stepped in to finish it. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment confirmed what the room suggested. Love died from internal injuries compounded by blunt force trauma. Time of death was estimated between 1 o'clock and 2 a.m. The beating had lasted minutes, not seconds. Cole spoke with a motel clerk later that morning. The man remembered Love checking in just before midnight. Alone, paying cash, asking for a room at the far end of the row. He had seemed nervous, but not frightened. The clerk described it as restless energy, the kind that came from anticipation rather than fear. Love had been waiting for someone. Security cameras covered the front office and the parking lot, but not the walkways between rooms. Footage showed Love pacing outside his door at 12:47 a.m., smoking, checking his phone repeatedly. At 1:06 a.m., a dark sedan entered the lot. The headlights were turned off before the car came to a full stop. Two figures exited. Their faces were never visible. They moved with coordination, not urgency. They did not run when they left. Cole pulled Love's background next. No violent record. A handful of minor charges years earlier, all resolved. Employment history showed a pattern of short-term jobs, mostly logistics, warehouse coordination, inventory management. Work that required trust, but not permanence. The kind of work that paid well when discretion mattered. In Love's pocket, Cole found a folded receipt from a tire shop in Barstow, dated 2 days earlier. 4 new tires, mid-range, paid in cash. The car Love had been driving, a borrowed sedan registered to a woman in Phoenix, had been found parked neatly outside his room, doors locked, nothing disturbed. Cole stood in the lot and looked at the open desert beyond the motel, the long stretch of road that brought people here and took them away again. Love had come to this place deliberately. He had chosen isolation. He had believed that whatever was coming could be managed behind a closed door. The violence suggested otherwise. By the end of the day, Cole understood one thing clearly. This was not a robbery that went wrong, and it was not spontaneous rage. Jacob Love had been located, confronted, and dismantled with intention. The severity of the beating was not emotional overflow. It was messaging, delivered directly to the body. Whoever did this had wanted Love to understand why it was happening, and they had wanted him to live long enough to feel it. By mid-morning, the motel had returned to something close to normal. Doors were shut again. Housekeeping carts rolled past the taped-off room without stopping. People checked out early, avoiding eye contact, eager to put distance between themselves and whatever had happened during the night. Violence like this did not linger in conversation. It lingered in posture. Detective Aaron Cole stayed behind after the uniforms cleared out. He walked the length of the motel row, counting doors, noting sightlines. Room 17, where Jacob Love died, sat far enough from the office to guarantee privacy, but close enough to the lot to allow a fast exit. Love had chosen it with care. Cole reviewed the camera footage again, frame by frame. The sedan that arrived at 1:06 a.m. was nondescript by design. Dark color. No visible damage. The two figures moved with familiarity, one slightly ahead of the other, spacing consistent with practice coordination. This was not improvisation. This was procedure. One detail stood out. As the second figure approached Love's door, he adjusted his jacket cuff, a small, unconscious movement. Cole had seen it before, in men who expected physical work. It was a preparation gesture, like rolling shoulders before lifting weight. The sedan left at 1:18 a.m., 12 minutes. That timing mattered. 12 minutes was long enough to extract information, to punish, to make a point. It was too long for a panic attack, too short for negotiation. Whatever was decided that night had already been decided before the door came down. Cole shifted focus to Jacob Love's last 48 hours. License plate readers showed Love entering Arizona from California 2 days earlier. He stopped briefly in Barstow for tires, then continued east without detour. He did not sightsee. He did not visit friends. He drove like someone following instructions rather than impulse. Phone records confirmed it. Love's missing phone had been active until the moment the sedan arrived. He received 3 calls that night, all from the same unregistered number. The calls were short, no voicemail, No text follow-up. The final call ended less than a minute before the door was kicked in. Cole believed Love had been summoned, not hunted. The woman who owned the sedan Love had been driving lived in Phoenix and worked nights at a medical billing office. She reported the car missing that morning but showed no signs of panic. When Cole interviewed her, she admitted knowing Love casually. He had asked to borrow the car for a few days, paid her cash up front, and told her not to ask questions. She had not. She also mentioned something else. Love had been scared, but not in the way people usually were. He had not talked about being followed or threatened. He had talked about having gone too far, about touching something he did not fully understand. He had asked her, almost casually, whether she believed people could disappear without anyone noticing. Cole left her apartment with the sense that Love had not been running. He had been repositioning. The next lead came from a scrapyard 10 miles outside Kingman, a place that processed wrecked vehicles and discarded machinery without much oversight. A night watchman reported unusual activity the same night Love died. A dark sedan arrived just after midnight, followed by a pickup truck with no plates. The vehicle stayed less than 15 minutes. The watchman had not intervened. People who stayed late at scrapyards learned quickly when not to look too closely. Cole walked the yard that afternoon. The heat pressed down hard, flattening sound and thought. Near the crusher, he found disturbed gravel and faint drag marks leading toward a pile of scrap metal recently compacted. The timing matched. The volume suggested something bulky but not massive. Cole did not need to dig it up to understand. The phone had likely died there. The violence in the motel room had not been about silencing Love's voice. That had already been done. The violence had been about accountability, about making sure Love paid for whatever breach he represented. The missing phone, the extracted time, the controlled exit, all pointed to a group that did not rely on fear alone. They relied on process. Cole began mapping Love's work history more aggressively. Logistics contracts, temporary consulting roles, inventory oversight for companies that moved high-value goods without drawing attention. Love had not stolen anything himself. He had facilitated access, flagged vulnerabilities, smoothed paths. He had been useful because he was forgettable, until he wasn't. Cole received confirmation late that evening that Love's fingerprints had been found on a shipping manifest linked to a hijacked cargo load 6 months earlier. The case had gone unresolved, written off as an inside job without a suspect. Love had never been charged. He had never been named. Cole believed Love had tried to leverage what he knew, not to expose it publicly, but to renegotiate his position within it. The beating suggested that the response to that attempt had been unanimous. As night fell again over the desert, Cole stood outside the motel, looking at the repaired doorframe of room 17. New wood had been fitted, sanded, painted. The damage was already being erased. Jacob Love had died violently, but not loudly. His death was meant to correct behavior, not attract attention. The people responsible would not talk. They would not boast. They would simply adjust and continue. Cole understood then that the case would not end with a single arrest or confession. It would end, if it ended at all, with pressure applied in places far removed from the motel room, places where violence wore cleaner clothes. And somewhere in that system, the message delivered to Jacob Love was still being understood. The violence did not end with Jacob Love's body. It echoed outward, not in blood but in behavior. Within days of the murder, 3 logistics contracts Love had worked on were abruptly terminated. 2 shipping managers resigned without notice. A storage facility outside Needles shut down operations for maintenance and never reopened. The system Love had touched began shedding weight, cutting loose anything that might still remember him. Detective Aaron Cole tracked the retreat carefully. He understood this pattern. When organized violence succeeded, it was followed by cleanup, not celebration. The goal was not dominance, it was stability. Cole pushed where he could. He subpoenaed records tied to Love's past contracts, focusing not on crimes, but on overlaps. Warehouses that appeared repeatedly, routes that bent around inspection hubs, night transfers that avoided cameras by minutes, not miles. Slowly, a corridor emerged, stretching from Southern California through Arizona and east toward Texas. It moved high-value cargo, electronics, pharmaceuticals, unregistered equipment, nothing that looked illegal until it vanished. Love had been a hinge in that corridor. Cole received confirmation that the dark sedan seen at the motel had been abandoned in Las Vegas 2 days after the murder. It had been wiped thoroughly, then left unlocked in a long-term parking structure. No prints, no fibers, no effort to disguise its disposal. The message was the same as the beating. Clean enough to function, violent enough to discourage curiosity. Cole interviewed one of Love's former supervisors, a man who insisted he barely remembered him. The interview changed tone when Cole described the motel room, not graphically, but precisely. The supervisor's hands began to shake. He admitted that Love had been warned months earlier. Not threatened, warned. He had been told that asking questions disrupted balance, and that balance was enforced. Love had not listened. Another lead surfaced from an unexpected place. A highway patrol officer remembered stopping a pickup truck near the state line the night Love died. The truck had been riding low, suspension strained. The driver was calm, polite, and eager to comply. The officer let him go. The plates were registered to a shell company tied loosely to one of the dissolved logistics firms Love had worked with. Cole understood now that the beating was not spontaneous punishment. It was procedure. Love had been summoned to the motel because it was neutral ground. The door had been kicked in because consent was no longer relevant. The beating had been prolonged because it served two purposes. It extracted confirmation, and it delivered warning. The warning was not for Love. He was already finished. It was for anyone else who might consider stepping out of alignment. Cole brought the case to the state task force overseeing organized cargo theft. They listened, took notes, and nodded in familiar places. They did not promise arrests. They promised monitoring. The corridor Love had been part of was known to them, but never cleanly enough to dismantle. Love's death was not an anomaly. It was maintenance. That knowledge sat heavily with Cole. He returned once more to room 17. The motel manager had repainted the walls. The carpet had been replaced. The room smelled of cleanser and cheap air freshener. Nothing remained of the violence except the memory of its arrangement. Cole stood where Love had likely been standing when the door came in. He imagined the first impact, the shock, the moment when negotiation ended and survival took over. Love had not been brave. He had been overwhelmed. The brutality was designed to strip dignity first, then life. Cole knew then that Love had not died because he was dangerous. He had died because he believed proximity to power gave him leverage. He believed knowing where things moved gave him a voice in how they moved. He had been wrong. The people who killed Jacob Love did not see him as a man. They saw him as a failure of containment, and they corrected it the only way their system allowed. As Cole closed the door behind him, he understood that the case would likely end without names attached to the worst acts. Charges would come later, diluted, disconnected from the motel room and the broken body that made them possible. Jacob Love's death would be absorbed into reports, statistics, and quiet warnings passed along routes he once helped keep open. The desert would keep its silence, and somewhere down the highway, another door would remain standing because of what happened in room 17. The arrest came quietly, which felt appropriate. It was not for murder. 6 weeks after Jacob Love was beaten to death, a federal indictment unsealed in Phoenix charged 4 men connected to a regional logistics firm with racketeering, fraud, and conspiracy tied to cargo diversion. The language was careful, almost antiseptic. It described manipulated manifests, falsified loss reports, shell companies cycling inventory through ghost facilities. Love's name appeared once, buried in a paragraph that identified him as a, quote, intermediary whose cooperation ceased. There was no mention of the motel. Detective Aaron Cole watched the press conference on a muted television in his office. The men arrested stood straight, hands cuffed, faces calm. They looked like accountants, not killers. None of them had been in the sedan. None of them had kicked in the door. Their role had been authorization, not execution. Cole knew how that worked. The man who had driven the rented sedan was identified later through an unrelated traffic stop in New Mexico. He carried multiple IDs, none real. He had scars on his knuckles and a fractured bone in his foot that never healed correctly. He died in a holding cell 3 months later from what was ruled cardiac failure. No interview was ever completed. The pickup truck stopped near the state line was traced to a subcontractor who disappeared before charges could be filed. His house was found empty, furniture gone, walls bare. He had taken only what could fit in a single vehicle. He did not leave a forwarding address. The pawn shop receipt surfaced again when Cole least expected it. A clerk from a different location, 200 miles away, reported a man attempting to return identical items, unused, purchased the same night Love died. The man left before police arrived. The items were discarded behind a dumpster and recovered hours later, preparation discarded when no longer needed. Cole visited Jacob Love's mother once, months after the case lost momentum. She lived in a manufactured home outside Prescott, kept neat and quiet. She did not ask for details. She asked only whether her son had suffered. Cole told her the truth, without decoration. He did not soften it. He believed she deserved to know what had been done to him. She nodded once and said nothing more. In the end, Jacob Love was recorded as a cooperating individual whose actions contributed to the disruption of an interstate criminal enterprise. His death was listed as unresolved, violence by unknown assailants. No one was charged for the beating. No one ever would be. The motel room continued to rent. Truck traffic along the corridor slowed for a time, then resumed with new names and cleaner paperwork. Routes adjusted. Personnel changed. The system absorbed the shock and corrected itself. Cole filed his final report late one night, alone in the office. He described the violence plainly, the way it had unfolded, the way it had been used. He did not speculate beyond what he could prove. He knew the report would be read carefully, then archived. Jacob Love had been killed not because he stole, or threatened, or exposed anything publicly. He had been killed because he misunderstood the terms. He believed participation granted protection. He believed knowledge created leverage. He believed violence was a last resort. The people who came through his door believed violence was infrastructure. The desert did not remember his name. The highway did not slow. The motel frame held firm when the next guest locked their door. And somewhere, in another anonymous room, someone else considered whether knowing too much was worth the cost. Jacob Love had already answered that question with his body. Now let's jump into a new story for tonight. The cabin door had been torn off its hinges and left leaning against a pine tree, snow collecting along the splintered edge. The force required to do that was not accidental. It suggested anger that needed a surface to break against before it found flesh. Inside, the heat was still running. The small living room was thick with the smell of blood and burned wood from a fireplace that had been fed too heavily. Soot streaked the stone. A chair lay shattered near the hearth. One leg snapped clean through. Blood soaked the rug beneath it, dark and uneven, pressed deep into the fibers by movement and weight. The body was in the bedroom. Kyle Benton lay face down across the foot of the bed, his arms twisted behind him, wrists bound with duct tape pulled tight enough to leave purple ridges in the skin. His back was exposed, his shirt cut away in long strips rather than torn. The skin beneath was bruised and split in places, marked by repeated impacts delivered with something long and rigid. A broken fireplace poker lay nearby, bent slightly near the tip. Benton's head showed the final damage. The skull was fractured along the temple, the blow angled downward, delivered after he was already immobilized. There was no defensive trauma to the hands beyond the early stages. Once he was bound, the violence became one-sided. This had not been a fight. The cabin sat outside a small mountain town, accessible only by a narrow road that twisted upward through dense forest. It was used seasonally, rented short-term to people who wanted isolation without questions. No close neighbors, no cameras. Snowfall overnight had softened the scene, but not erased it. Deputy Mark Alvarez arrived first, hiking the last stretch when the road became impassable. He stopped just inside the doorway and did not move for several seconds. The scene carried intention. Every mark, every placement felt considered. Benton was 35 years old. His wallet lay open on the nightstand, cash untouched. His phone was gone. A laptop sat smashed against the wall, screen broken inward as if struck deliberately. Whatever had been on it had mattered enough to destroy completely. Alvarez noticed the calendar tacked to the wall near the kitchenette. One date was circled heavily in red. Yesterday. Detective Lena Ward arrived just after dawn, breath fogging as she stepped into the cold cabin. She took in the room slowly, letting the violence speak before she imposed questions on it. The bindings told her Benton had been alive for most of what was done to him. The cuts in his shirt told her the attacker wanted access, not speed. The broken poker told her the weapon had been chosen from the environment, not brought in for efficiency. That detail mattered. People who planned murders brought tools. People who planned confrontations used what was close. Ward followed the footprints outside. One set belonged to Benton, staggered and shallow near the door, then disappearing. Another set was heavier, more deliberate, boots with deep tread. They approached directly and left the same way, not running, not circling. A pickup truck had been parked near the tree line. Tire tracks showed it idled for several minutes after arrival. Waiting. Inside the bedroom, Ward found a small object on the dresser, easy to miss among the damage. A child's plastic bracelet, snapped in half, its bright colors out of place against the dark wood and blood. Ward picked it up carefully. Kyle Benton had no children. As the snow continued to fall outside, quiet and indifferent, Ward understood the shape of the case forming. This was not a random act. It was not opportunistic violence or a deal gone wrong. The restraint, the pacing, the choice to keep Benton alive through most of it all pointed to one thing. This was a reckoning. Someone had come up the mountain not to kill quickly, but to be seen by one person, in one place, at the exact moment they had chosen. Whatever Benton had done had not faded with time. It had waited, and now it had arrived, patient and brutal, to collect. Detective Lena Ward did not treat the cabin like a mystery at first. She treated it like a memory that had been forced into the open. The bindings told her the order of events more clearly than blood ever could. Benton had been controlled early, his wrists taped behind him while he was still strong enough to resist. The tape was industrial grade, stretched tight, wrapped with care rather than haste. Whoever did this wanted him alive and present. The restraint was not about convenience, it was about attention. Ward examined the tape ends. They were cut cleanly with a blade, not torn. The cuts were angled, consistent, practiced. This was not the first time the attacker had bound someone. The broken poker told the next part of the story. It had snapped from repeated impact, not a single blow. The strikes landed across Benton's back and shoulders, places that caused pain without shutting the body down too quickly. Someone had calibrated the damage, holding back just enough to keep him conscious. Ward felt the cold settle deeper as she moved through the room. The smashed laptop was personal. It had been struck after Benton was restrained, judging by the blood transfer on the casing. The attacker had looked at it first, then destroyed it. That suggested recognition, not impulse. Whatever was on that screen had meaning to both men. Ward asked for Benton's background before she left the mountain. Kyle Benton had grown up 2 towns over. He worked construction seasonally, bounced between jobs, and rented the cabin for long weekends when he wanted to disappear. He had no active warrants, no known enemies, no recent disputes reported. On paper, he was unremarkable. Paper rarely mattered in cases like this. Ward drove down the mountain as the snow thickened, following the tire tracks as long as she could before they dissolved into the plowed road. The pickup had exited calmly. No spinning, no acceleration. Whoever drove it knew the road well enough to trust it. Back at the station, Ward began pulling older records, not recent ones. People capable of this kind of violence rarely appeared suddenly. They carried it for years, letting it shape itself around something specific. She found it 3 hours later. A missing persons report from 9 years earlier. A boy named Ethan Moore, age 7, last seen near a campsite 20 miles from Benton's cabin. The search lasted weeks. No body was found. No charges were filed. The case went cold and stayed there. Kyle Benton had been questioned once. He told investigators he saw nothing. Ward pulled the interview transcript. Benton's answers were short, cooperative, and careful. He placed himself nearby, but not close enough to matter. There was no evidence to contradict him at the time. The file closed quietly. Ward studied the photographs attached to the report. Ethan Moore wore a plastic bracelet. Bright colors. Cheap material. Snapped easily. Ward returned to the evidence table and looked again at the broken bracelet found in the cabin. The colors matched. The style was identical. The break was fresh. Someone had kept it. That detail settled into place with a weight that did not lift. The attack was no longer abstract. It was anchored. Ward contacted Ethan Moore's parents, now divorced and living in different states. The call was not easy. She did not explain the cabin or the body right away. She asked instead whether their son had owned a bracelet like the one she described. The mother began to cry before Ward finished. The father said nothing for a long time, then asked one question. Was Kyle Benton dead? Ward did not answer directly. She requested records on Benton's movements around the time of Ethan's disappearance. The old file showed Benton had been working a temporary job near the campsite that summer. He had access. He had opportunity. He had never been cleared. He had simply not been charged. 9 years was a long time to wait. Ward began to understand the pacing of the violence in the cabin. The restraint. the deliberate injury. The choice to use what was there instead of bringing a weapon. The attacker had not come to execute Benton. He had come to confront him. The circled date on the calendar made sense now. It was the anniversary of Ethan Moore's disappearance. Ward sat back in her chair as the case shifted fully into focus. This was not a robbery. It was not a dispute. It was not a crime of passion that flared and burned out. It was a return. Someone had come up the mountain carrying 9 years of unanswered questions, 9 years of restraint, 9 years of imagining what had happened to a child who never came home. And when they reached the man who had lived freely through all of it, they had decided that answers were no longer enough. The mountain had not hidden what happened in that cabin. It had simply waited until someone was ready to bring it back down. Detective Lena Ward stopped thinking about the killer as an unknown and began thinking about him as someone who had been very close for a very long time. The bracelet was not evidence of opportunity. It was evidence of endurance. It had been kept intact for nearly a decade, carried through moves, jobs, and seasons. That kind of preservation required intention. It required the kind of memory that did not fade or soften, only sharpen. Ward pulled the Moore family file again, this time focusing not on Ethan, but on who had searched for him after the case went quiet. One name appeared repeatedly in volunteer logs and follow-up notes, long after official efforts slowed. Thomas Moore, Ethan's uncle. He had been present during the early search, then again months later, then sporadically over the next 2 years. He walked terrain others avoided, returned to sites already cleared, and filed tips that led nowhere. Eventually, the calls stopped. The notes in the file described him as persistent, then withdrawn. Thomas Moore lived alone now, 2 counties over. He worked as a mechanic at a heavy equipment yard, a job that rewarded strength, patience, and familiarity with tools meant to endure abuse. His pickup truck was an older model, lifted slightly, tires worn unevenly from back roads and snow. Ward requested a warrant quietly. Before it was approved, she drove to the equipment yard herself. The yard was mostly empty by late afternoon. A line of plows sat idle near the fence, their blades chipped and scarred. Moore's truck was parked at the far end, backed into a space as if for a quick exit. Snow clung to the wheel wells, not fresh enough to matter, not old enough to ignore. Ward did not approach immediately. She watched. Moore worked alone, methodical, moving from machine to machine without distraction. He favored his right shoulder, rolling it occasionally, as if working through stiffness. When he finished, he cleaned his hands carefully, scrubbing beneath his nails longer than necessary. He did not rush. He did not look over his shoulder. When Ward finally made contact, Moore did not ask why she was there. He recognized her badge and nodded once, as if the moment had arrived exactly when expected. The interview room was small and cold, the kind of space that made silence feel heavier than sound. Moore sat straight-backed, hands folded, eyes steady. He did not deny being at the cabin. He did not deny restraining Benton. He did not deny the beating. What he denied was improvisation. Moore described the night with the same precision Ward had seen in the cabin. He waited until Benton was alone. He parked where the truck would not be seen from the road. He knocked because he wanted Benton to open the door and see him. He wanted recognition before anything else happened. When Benton saw the bracelet, Moore said, his resistance changed. Not stronger. Smaller. Moore bound him because he did not trust himself to stop otherwise. He struck him with the poker, because it was there, because Benton had used whatever was there 9 years earlier. He kept Benton alive because he needed him awake. Ward listened, noting how Moore's account avoided spectacle. There was no relish. There was no apology. The violence was framed as a sequence of necessary steps, each one chosen to mirror something already done. Moore admitted he destroyed the laptop after seeing photographs stored there. Images of campsites, of children, of places that had never been searched deeply enough. He did not describe what else he saw. He did not need to. When asked why he ended it the way he did, Moore paused. He said there was nothing left to ask. Forensics confirmed what Moore had already given. His DNA was on the tape, on the poker, on the broken chair. Benton's blood was embedded in the fibers of Moore's jacket, deep and dried, not transferred accidentally. The pickup tracks matched. The path was clean. Ward stood alone in the evidence room that night, the bracelet sealed in a bag beneath the lights. The colors were still bright. The plastic was still cheap. It had outlasted a childhood, a disappearance, and a man who had never been held accountable in life. The case was no longer about what happened on the mountain. It was about what had been allowed to remain unresolved for 9 years, building pressure in a single place until it could only be released one way. Thomas Moore had not hunted widely. He had waited precisely, and when the waiting ended, he did not miss. Thomas Moore did not ask for a lawyer. He asked whether anyone had finally gone back to the places on Kyle Benton's computer. Detective Lena Ward did not answer right away. She watched Moore's face as the question hung between them. There was no anxiety there, no bargaining. Only the careful accounting of a man who had already spent years preparing for an outcome and wanted to know whether anything had been salvaged from the cost. Moore spoke without prompting. He described the night 9 years earlier as something that never settled into memory, so much as lodged there, sharp and immovable. He had been visiting his sister's family when Ethan disappeared. He searched because searching was the only thing that kept his hands busy enough to stop imagining what Benton had done once the boy was out of sight. When the official search ended, Moore kept going. He learned the trails. He learned how people missed things. He learned how time erased tracks and softened attention. When Benton was questioned and released, Moore said, the shape of the future changed. Justice, as it existed, was no longer something that arrived. It was something that waited. Moore tracked Benton carefully, not obsessively, but consistently. He learned where he worked, where he stayed, how he vanished into the mountains when he wanted to be alone. Moore waited for the anniversary because anniversaries mattered. They fixed time to a point and forced memory to stand still. He brought the bracelet because he wanted Benton to know exactly which life had come back for him. He bound Benton because he needed the conversation to last. He stopped when he did because there was nothing left to extract that would change what had already happened. Ward ended the interview when Moore finished. There was nothing left to clarify. The case moved quickly after that. The confession aligned with every piece of evidence. There was no ambiguity to exploit, no alternate theory to pursue. Moore was charged with first-degree murder. He entered a guilty plea at the first opportunity, declining to make a statement in court. At sentencing, Moore stood straight, despite the cuffs, his shoulders squared, his eyes forward. He did not look toward the benches. He did not speak when invited. The sentence was life, without expectation, softened by time. Afterward, Ward returned to the cabin one last time before it was released back to its owner. Daylight stripped the place of drama. Blood had been cleaned, the door rehung, the fireplace cold. What remained was the geometry of rooms where something final had occurred and would not repeat itself. Investigators followed the trails found in Benton's photographs. They searched the campsites again, deeper this time. With time and resources that had not existed before, they did not find Ethan Moore. They did find small confirmations. Disturbances in soil. Remnants of activity where no activity should have been. Enough to end speculation without offering relief. The bracelet was returned to Ethan's mother. She held it without speaking for a long time, then asked only that it not be entered into any display or archive. It had served its purpose. As winter deepened, the mountain grew quiet again. Snow filled the tire ruts. Wind erased footprints. The cabin resumed its anonymity, a structure among trees. Ward understood, in the end, that the violence in that place had not been chaotic or contagious. It had been contained, directed inward toward a single man and a single reckoning. Moore had not acted to start something, he had acted to stop waiting. Nothing about it was lawful. Nothing about it was clean. But it was complete in a way the original crime had never been. The mountain kept its silence, and somewhere beneath it, a question that had waited 9 years finally stopped asking itself, what would have happened if someone had come sooner? Now, let's begin another story for tonight. The front door was still open when deputies arrived. It swung slightly in the wind, hinges creaking with each movement. The sound carrying across the empty fields like something unfinished. Inside, the house was lit, room by room. Every light turned on, as if someone had wanted there to be no shadows left. The body was in the kitchen. Raymond Keller lay on his back beside the table, one leg bent awkwardly beneath him, the other stretched straight toward the door. His throat had been cut deep enough that there was no question about intent. The wound was wide, uneven, and angry, opened with force rather than precision. Blood covered the tile floor in thick, overlapping patterns, spattered high against cabinet doors and dragged outward where Keller had tried to crawl. He had not died quickly. A cast-iron skillet lay near his head, its rim darkened and slick. Keller's face was broken in places that suggested he had been struck repeatedly before the knife was used. One eye was collapsed. His nose was flattened. His hands were shredded with defensive wounds, fingers split and bent at unnatural angles. This had been personal. The farmhouse sat alone outside Great Bend, Kansas, surrounded by harvested fields and dirt roads that carried traffic only when someone meant to be there. Keller lived by himself. He had no livestock, no close neighbors, no security system. He kept his doors locked out of habit, not fear. Tonight, someone had been let inside. Detective Hannah Rowe arrived just before dawn. She stood in the doorway and took in the violence without stepping forward, letting her eyes trace the order of events. The kitchen table had been shoved aside hard enough to leave gouges in the floor. One chair was snapped cleanly in half. The refrigerator door stood open, its light glowing over smeared handprints that slid downward and disappeared. Keller had been standing when it started. Rowe followed the blood back through the house. It led into the living room, where the television still played a muted late-night program. The screen cracked down the middle. The carpet was dark with blood there too, but thinner, more spread out. The fight had moved room to room, not chased, but driven. Someone had wanted Keller awake. In the bedroom, Rowe found the knife. It lay on the dresser, placed carefully on a folded towel. Blade cleaned just enough to stop dripping, but not enough to erase what it had done. That detail stopped her cold. This was not panic. This was conclusion. The medical examiner confirmed what the house already told. Keller had suffered blunt force trauma first. He had been incapacitated, not killed. The cut to his throat came later, delivered when resistance was already failing. Time of death was estimated between 11:30 p.m. and midnight. Rose stood at the kitchen sink and looked out into the dark fields beyond the window. The glass was intact. No sign of forced entry anywhere in the house. Keller had opened the door for his killer, or the killer had already been inside. Keller was 52 years old. His record showed a conviction for aggravated assault 12 years earlier. The victim in that case was a 16-year-old boy. Keller served 4 years in prison and was released quietly, his name fading from public attention but not from memory. Rowe pulled the old case file before leaving the scene. The boy's name was Daniel Mercer. Mercer survived the assault but carried permanent damage, both physical and cognitive. Keller claimed it was an accident. The court disagreed, but not enough to keep him locked away forever. Mercer's family left town shortly after the trial. Rowe did not need to read far to feel the shape of what she was holding. Revenge cases announced themselves differently than others. They carried a density, a weight that settled into rooms and did not lift easily. They were not efficient. They were thorough. As Rowe stepped back outside, the sky beginning to pale over the fields, she understood one thing with certainty. Whoever killed Raymond Keller had not come to rob him. They had come to finish something that had been waiting a long time to be finished, and they had taken their time doing it. Detective Hannah Rowe did not announce the direction of the investigation. She did not need to. In towns like this, the past never stayed buried for long once blood brought it back up. Raymond Keller's name had not been spoken much in recent years, but it had not been forgotten either. When word spread that he was dead, people did not ask why. They asked when. Rowe began with the old file. The assault on Daniel Mercer had taken place in the same farmhouse kitchen 12 years earlier. Different floor, different cabinets. Same layout. The report described Keller as intoxicated and angry, his temper triggered by a perceived slight that no one else remembered clearly. Mercer had been a guest, a teenager helping with chores for extra cash. The beating lasted long enough for neighbors to hear shouting, but not long enough for anyone to intervene. Mercer survived, but barely. Medical records showed extensive facial fractures, brain swelling, and permanent damage to his left eye. He never returned to school. He required ongoing care. His parents moved him out of state within months of the sentencing, unable to remain where Keller still lived. Rowe studied the photographs from that case carefully. The injuries mirrored what she saw in Keller's kitchen now. Blunt force, facial trauma, defensive wounds. The pattern felt deliberate, almost reverent in its repetition. Someone had remembered exactly how it happened. Rowe drove to the Mercer family's last known address in Oklahoma. The house was empty, windows boarded, yard choked with weeds. A neighbor remembered them vaguely. Quiet people, kept to themselves, left years ago without explanation. Rowe expanded the search. Daniel Mercer was found living 2 states away under a different surname. He was 30 now. His public footprint was thin. Disability benefits. Part-time custodial work at a church. No criminal record. No registered vehicle. Rowe requested a welfare check through local police rather than driving straight there. She wanted timing, not drama. The response came back within the hour. Daniel Mercer was not home. The officer reported the apartment was clean and orderly. No signs of struggle. No indication Mercer had left in a hurry. His phone was gone. His wallet remained on the table. A calendar on the wall had a date circled in red. The date was the night Raymond Keller died. Rowe felt the weight shift then, from theory to inevitability. Back at the farmhouse, forensic technicians found something earlier missed. A partial boot print in the dried blood near the living room threshold. The tread was worn unevenly, heavier on the outer heel. It suggested a gait imbalance, possibly from an old injury. Daniel Mercer walked with a limp. Roe drove the dirt road surrounding Keller's property again, this time slower. Tire tracks led away from the house toward the main road, shallow but clear. A single vehicle, narrow wheelbase, likely a pickup. It had been parked briefly near the field entrance, then driven away without haste. A farmhand down the road reported seeing headlights late that night. One vehicle, parked too far off the road for a delivery. The driver sat inside with the lights off for several minutes before turning onto the highway, waiting. Roe understood that Daniel Mercer had not rushed this. He had returned to the place where it began. He had waited for Keller to recognize him. He had let Keller understand exactly why this was happening. The placement of the knife on the towel told her that much. It was not an afterthought. It was punctuation. Roe reviewed Keller's final hours. He had gone to the bar in town earlier that evening, drank alone, left before midnight. Several patrons remembered him arguing briefly with someone outside. They could not describe the man clearly. They remembered only that Keller looked shaken afterward. Fear had arrived before death. Roe sat in her office that night, the old and new photographs spread out side by side. 12 years apart. Same house, same violence. Different bodies. Revenge did not always erupt in rage. Sometimes it waited, patient and precise, until it could mirror what had been done. Daniel Mercer had not killed in the dark. He had killed in full light, with the house illuminated, with Keller awake, with nothing left unsaid. The search for him began officially that night, but Roe already understood the truth she would have to carry. This was not a crime that could be undone. It was a crime that had been completed exactly as intended. Daniel Mercer did not run in the way fugitives usually did. There were no frantic withdrawals, no borrowed cars abandoned in ditches, no calls to people who might talk. His movement was deliberate and sparse, stitched together from public transit, short rides, and long waits. He traveled the way someone did when time no longer pressed forward, only outward. Detective Hannah Rowe tracked him by absence first. Daniel's disability payments had not been accessed since the night of the murder. His phone, though missing, had not connected to any network afterward. A bus ticket purchased with cash placed him in Wichita the following morning, boarding early, sitting alone near the back. Security footage showed him stepping off calmly, adjusting the strap of a worn backpack, his limp visible but controlled. He looked lighter. Rowe requested stills from the bar the night Keller died. One camera had caught a partial angle outside. The footage showed Keller standing close to another man, shoulders squared, jaw working as if mid-argument. The other man did not mirror the posture. He stood still, head slightly tilted, listening. When Keller gestured sharply, the man did not step back. That stillness told Rowe more than the words she could not hear. Mercer had not come to fight. He had come to confirm. Witnesses at the bar remembered Keller's expression when he came back inside. The bravado had drained. He drank faster. He left early. Fear had found him before the knife did. Rowe received confirmation that a pickup truck matching the tire tracks had been found abandoned outside a small town in eastern Kansas. It was registered to a man who had died 2 years earlier. The vehicle had been purchased at a lien auction with cash, then kept dormant until needed. Inside, technicians found little: a fast food bag, a road map with several towns circled lightly in pencil, no fingerprints usable enough to build on. Mercer had prepared without spectacle. Rowe followed the circles on the map. They marked places with anonymity, not comfort: truck stops, bus depots. motels that rented by the night and forgot by morning. She requested door logs, cameras, and keycard records. The picture that emerged was steady. Mercer moved one place at a time, never doubling back, never staying long enough to be asked his name. One motel clerk remembered him clearly, not because of anything he did, but because of what he asked. He wanted a room with a tub. The clerk assumed injury. Mercer nodded once and said nothing more. Rowe understood then that Keller's house had not been the only place Mercer returned to. He was revisiting pain as a geography, moving through it with intention rather than avoidance. The violence had not emptied him. It had organized him. Forensic results from the farmhouse came back with a quiet confirmation. Keller's blood was found beneath the skin of Mercer's knuckles, trapped in old scar tissue where bone had healed poorly years earlier. The match was clean. There was no ambiguity. Rowe issued a warrant. The search expanded across state lines, but the urgency felt different now. Mercer was not escalating. He was concluding. There were no other names tied to Keller's old case, no other loose ends that required blood. Whatever Daniel Mercer had come to do, he had already done it. Rowe spoke with Mercer's former therapist by phone, careful to stay within legal bounds. The therapist described a man who did not fantasize about violence, who did not rehearse it verbally. He spoke instead about symmetry, about returning imbalance to rest. He did not describe anger. He described relief as a concept he hoped to experience someday. The therapist had not believed that relief would look like this. Late on the fourth night, a highway patrol officer spotted Mercer walking along a frontage road outside Salina, moving steadily despite his limp, backpack slung over one shoulder. He did not run when approached. He did not resist when cuffed. He asked only one question. Was Keller dead? Rowe arrived at the holding facility just before dawn. Mercer sat on the bench where he had been placed, hands folded, eyes open. His face bore fresh, bruising across the knuckles and jaw, the kind that came from effort rather than defense. He looked exhausted, but not confused. Rowe did not question him yet. She wanted to understand the stillness she saw in him now, the absence of urgency. Whatever storm had driven him back to the farmhouse had already passed. Mercer had not been chasing freedom. He had been chasing an ending. And he had reached it. Daniel Mercer waived his right to an attorney within minutes. He did not do it impulsively. He asked for water first. He adjusted himself on the bench, favoring his damaged leg, then nodded once, as if a private calculation had reached its end. Detective Hannah Rowe watched from across the table, attentive to what he did not do as much as what he did. He did not scan the room. He did not fidget. He did not look at the door. When he spoke without urgency. He described returning to Great Bend weeks earlier, parking at the edge of the fields at night, watching Keller's house from a distance. He learned Keller's habits the way people learned weather, patiently and without judgment. Lights on and off, the sound of a television, the nights Keller drank, the nights he did not. Mercer waited until the routine stopped changing. The night of the murder, Mercer went to the bar first. He wanted Keller to see him in public, under light, where recognition could not hide. He wanted Keller to carry the knowledge home. Mercer said that mattered more than surprise. Fear needed time to settle. He followed Keller at a distance. He did not hurry. When Keller unlocked the door, Mercer was already close enough to hear the lock turn. He knocked once. Keller opened it. Inside, Mercer said, the house felt smaller than he remembered. The kitchen looked the same. The table had not moved. Keller recognized him immediately. Mercer did not repeat his name. He did not need to. Keller knew. Mercer described the first strike as necessary rather than angry. He wanted Keller on the ground quickly, not to escape. but to listen. He used the skillet because it was there, because Keller had used whatever was there years earlier. The fight moved because Keller tried to get away. Mercer did not let him. Roe listened without interrupting, her pen moving only to anchor time and sequence. Mercer's account was spare, exact, and devoid of ornament. He did not describe satisfaction, he described completion. When he reached the knife, he paused, not for emphasis, but for accuracy. He waited until Keller understood that there would be no stopping point. Afterward, Mercer cleaned his hands in the sink and placed the knife where it could be found easily. He turned on all the lights because darkness felt like concealment, and concealment felt wrong. He left the door open because the house no longer belonged to Keller. He walked away. Roe asked one question when he finished. Why now? Mercer looked down at his hands, the old scars bright against newer bruises. He said time did not make what happened smaller. It made it heavier. Keller had continued living in the same place, under the same roof, while Mercer learned how to live inside damage. Returning the violence to its origin felt like closing a circuit. Roe ended the interview there. The case moved quickly after that. The evidence was overwhelming. The confession aligned with forensics. There was no doubt to argue. Mercer was charged with first-degree murder. He entered a guilty plea at arraignment, without hesitation. At sentencing, he did not address the court. He did not look at Keller's empty bench. He stood upright and still while the sentence was read. Life, with the possibility of parole far beyond the horizon of anything he might reasonably expect. Afterward, Roe returned to the farmhouse one last time. The lights were off now. The door was closed. The house had been stripped of evidence and sound, returned to a neutral quiet that did not belong to anyone. Fields moved in the wind the way they always had. Revenge murders often left residue, anger that spread outward, damage that multiplied. This one did not. It collapsed inward, sealing itself at the point of impact. Mercer had not killed to begin something. He had killed to end it. Roe understood that understanding did not excuse what he had done. It did not soften the violence or the finality. It simply explained the shape of it, the reason it stayed, contained. The road away from the farmhouse stretched straight and empty under the rising sun. Somewhere behind Roe, a life sentence settled into place. Somewhere further back, a much older crime finally stopped moving. Nothing about it felt just, but it was finished. Now let's begin the next story. The call came in as a disturbance, not a homicide. A security guard at a shuttered strip mall on the south edge of Reno reported screaming, then a sound like metal striking concrete over and over again. By the time patrol arrived, the screaming had stopped. The lights in the parking lot flickered unevenly, half the fixtures dead, the rest buzzing like insects trapped in glass. The body was behind the former grocery store, near a loading dock that had not been used in years. Evan Richter lay on his side, with his knees drawn slightly inward, as if his body had tried to protect itself after his mind was no longer able to keep up. His skull was fractured in multiple places, not crushed all at once, but damaged incrementally, the way bone failed under repeated impact. Blood coated the concrete in thick arcs and droplets, each one placed by movement rather than spray. A cinder block lay nearby, one corner darkened and slick. This had not been a single blow. Detective Paul Marrow arrived as rain began to fall, light at first, then steady enough to soften the edges of the scene without washing it away. He crouched near the body and studied the angles. Richter's injuries suggested he had been forced to his knees early, then struck from above. Several impacts landed after he collapsed, delivered without urgency. There was no wallet, no phone. His shoes were missing. That detail bothered Merrow immediately. Richter was 31 years old. His record showed petty theft, probation violations, and a dismissed assault charge from 5 years earlier. He worked temp jobs when he worked at all. The address on his license led to a weekly motel across town, paid in cash and checked into under different names. He existed lightly, the way people did when they did not expect to be remembered. But someone had remembered him tonight. The strip mall was a dead zone after dark. Businesses had closed one by one over the past decade, leaving behind empty units and unsecured service corridors. The loading dock area was shielded from the street by dumpsters and concrete barriers. Anyone who came here knew what they were doing. The security guard had not seen the attack. He heard it from inside his truck, parked at the far end of the lot. By the time he drove closer, headlights sweeping the dock, the attackers were already gone. He remembered only movement, two shapes retreating toward a black SUV with no visible plates. Merrow walked the perimeter slowly. Footprints overlapped in the wet dust, some deep, some light. At least two attackers, maybe three. One set of prints stopped abruptly near the body, pivoted, then resumed with purpose. Someone had taken the time to look down. Richter's shirt was torn open, buttons ripped away rather than undone. His chest was bruised, darkening already, with marks that suggested boots rather than fists. His wrists showed abrasions, circular and raw, as if they had been bound and then freed violently. This had not begun here. Merrow traced the blood trail backward. It led from the loading dock into the hollow interior of the former grocery store. The glass doors had been smashed inward earlier that night, not recently, the edges dulled by time. Inside, the floor was scattered with debris and old shelving. Near the center of the space, blood pooled thickly, darker and deeper than outside. Richter had been beaten inside, then dragged. The rain intensified, drumming against the metal awning over the dock. Officers moved quickly to preserve what they could. Merrow stood inside the empty store and imagined the sound of it earlier, the echo of impacts in a space designed to amplify noise. Someone had chosen this place because it would not matter who heard. Richter's phone was recovered later that night, crushed beneath a tire in a nearby alley. The SIM card was gone. His shoes were found miles away in a trash bin behind a closed auto parts store, laces cut cleanly through. That suggested time. The medical examiner's initial assessment confirmed Merrow's impression. Richter had not died instantly. The fatal injury came late, after prolonged blunt force trauma. Several blows had landed after he lost consciousness. Merrow returned to the loading dock just before dawn. The rain had washed the blood thinner now, spreading it into the cracks. The cinder block remained where it fell, too heavy to be an accident, too specific to be coincidence. This was not rage. It was instruction. Whatever Evan Richter had done, or failed to do, the response had been calibrated to make a point. The violence was excessive, but not uncontrolled. Someone wanted Richter to understand what was happening to him before it ended. As the sun lifted weakly over the empty storefronts, Merrow felt the familiar weight settle in. This was not a case that would announce itself loudly. It would pull inward, toward people who preferred to stay unnamed and places that were already forgotten. The disturbance call had been accurate, in a way. Something had been disturbed, and whatever balance Evan Richter had upset had just been violently corrected. By the second day, the strip mall had already begun to erase itself. A private cleanup crew arrived before noon, contracted by the property owner. Moving quickly and without questions, blood was pressure washed from the dock. The interior floor of the grocery store was scrubbed and sealed with a dull gray coating that flattened everything beneath it. What could not be removed was covered. What could not be covered was ignored. Detective Paul Merrow photographed the progress without interfering. He understood the rhythm. Places like this did not want to remember. They wanted to return to being invisible. Richter's autopsy clarified what the scene had suggested. He suffered at least 20 distinct impacts, delivered in phases. Early blows were disabling. Later ones were punitive. The final strike shattered the base of the skull, delivered from above while Richter was already down. Time of death was estimated nearly 30 minutes after the first injury. Someone had stayed. Merrow began with Richter's last week. Hotel records showed Richter checked into 3 different motels over 7 days, each time paying cash, each time requesting ground floor rooms near exits. He did not bring luggage. He moved the way people did when they did not expect to stay anywhere long. Phone metadata recovered partially from cloud backups showed frequent short calls to numbers that no longer existed. Burner phones cycling out. Communication designed to end cleanly. Merrow visited the weekly motel listed on Richter's license. The manager recognized him immediately. Richter paid on time and caused no trouble, but he asked unusual questions. Who else stayed on long term? Which rooms had cameras nearby? Which exits were covered by streetlights? He had not been planning a crime, he had been planning movement. A housekeeper recalled Richter leaving one morning with bruises already forming along his neck and jaw. When she asked if he was all right, he told her he had fallen. He smiled when he said it, too carefully. Merrow recognized that smile. It belonged to people who had already learned that explanations were safer than truth. The crushed phone told its own story. Forensics recovered fragments of deleted photos taken inside a warehouse space Merrow did not recognize at first. Pallets stacked too neatly. Industrial lighting hung temporarily from cables. A chalk mark on concrete that looked like a number or symbol. Richter had been somewhere he should not have photographed. Merrow circulated the images quietly through contacts in code enforcement and commercial leasing. A zoning officer recognized the layout as a former appliance distribution center north of town, officially vacant for over a year. Unofficially, it had been leased short-term through a property holding company that changed names frequently. Merrow drove there at dusk. The building was dark, its exterior unmarked. The padlocks were heavy and new. Tire tracks showed recent activity, but not enough to suggest permanent occupation. Inside, the space was empty now, stripped clean down to scuffed concrete and wall hooks. The chalk mark from Richter's photo was gone, scrubbed away aggressively enough to leave a pale scar. Someone had moved fast. Merrow returned to the strip mall and stood where the first blows likely landed. He imagined Richter brought in alive, perhaps already hurt, perhaps believing he could still talk his way out. The length of the beating suggested resistance that was punished rather than suppressed. Richter had not simply been killed, he had been corrected. The missing shoes continued to bother Merrow. Shoes were not evidence people usually removed, unless they mattered. Bare feet slowed escape. They also humiliated. They stripped someone of mobility and dignity at the same time. That choice felt personal. A break came from an unexpected direction. A tow truck driver called in after seeing Richter's photo on a local bulletin. 2 nights before the murder, he had towed a black SUV from a grocery store parking lot several miles east. The vehicle had no plates and no VIN visible on the dashboard. That alone was not unusual. What stood out was the damage. The rear bumper was dented inward, and the undercarriage was scraped with fresh concrete residue. The driver remembered the passenger, a man with blood on his boots. The tow yard still had the SUV. It had been abandoned after the tow fee was never paid. Inside, technicians found dried blood beneath the rear seat and a length of frayed rope stuffed into a door pocket. The rope fibers matched abrasions on Richter's wrists, Marrow stood beside the vehicle as it was processed, rain beginning again, tapping against the metal roof. The violence had moved through this SUV, then through the grocery store, then out into the open dock where it ended. This was not a random encounter. Richter had been brought in because he was already in trouble, already marked. The brutality was not about silencing him completely. It was about making sure that whatever he knew would die with him, reinforced by fear that would spread to anyone else standing close enough. As Marrow drove away from the tow yard, he understood the shape of the case more clearly now. Evan Richter had not been targeted because he was powerful. He had been targeted because he was weak enough to be made an example. And someone had taken their time making sure the example was unforgettable. Once the SUV was recovered, the case shifted from speculation to gravity. Detective Paul Marrow stopped asking what had happened to Evan Richter and began asking what Richter had been allowed to see before he died. The rope found in the SUV was not improvised. It was utility grade, the kind used to secure heavy loads, stiff enough to burn skin when pulled tight. The knots had been cut, rather than untied, clean slices made with a sharp blade. This had been restraint with intent, not panic. Marrow revisited Richter's history with a narrower lens. Not crime, not addiction, not instability, but usefulness. Richter had worked briefly as a night cleaner for a property maintenance company that serviced commercial spaces between tenants. The work gave him access without oversight. Keys, alarm codes, after-hours silence. He lasted less than 4 months before quitting abruptly. His supervisor described him as nervous near the end, distracted, jumpy at sudden noise. Richter had asked whether the company ever vetted secondary tenants, people who used spaces unofficially. The supervisor told him not to worry about things that did not concern him. Richter had worried anyway. Marrow traced the maintenance company's recent contracts and found the same holding company attached to the appliance warehouse Richter photographed. Short-term leases, cash-heavy payments, rapid turnover. Buildings occupied briefly, then vacated completely, scrubbed to emptiness. The pattern was not illegal. It was strategic. The violence began to make sense. Richter had likely discovered something that was not meant to be cataloged. He photographed it, a small act of defiance or insurance. He may have shown the images to someone else, or threatened to, or he may have simply been noticed, hesitating where others moved on. That was enough. Marrow interviewed a man named Colin Reese, a peripheral figure who ran a small scrap hauling operation. Reese admitted to knowing Richter casually. They drank together sometimes. Richter had mentioned a job that paid too well for how little oversight it had. He had joked about disappearing into buildings that technically did not exist. Then, a week before his death, the jokes stopped. Reese described Richter as frightened but focused. Someone who believed he had leverage, but did not yet understand how fragile it was. Richter had talked about meeting people to straighten things out. He believed that knowing where and when something moved gave him power. Marrow recognized that belief. It showed up in men who misunderstood systems built without regard for individual survival. The meeting that ended Richter's life likely began elsewhere. The grocery store interior showed evidence of prolonged control, not ambush. Richter had been restrained, beaten, questioned. The dock was only where it concluded, when compliance was no longer useful. The cinder block was not symbolic, it was convenient. It ended the process without ceremony. Marrow located surveillance footage from a traffic camera 2 blocks from the strip mall. It captured the black SUV idling briefly before turning in, headlights off. A second vehicle followed, a light-colored pickup that did not stop. It slowed just enough to confirm presence, then continued down the road. Coordination, not participation. Marrow knew then that only one of the attackers had needed to touch Richter. The others existed to witness, to reinforce, to make sure the lesson was internalized by everyone involved. The violence was not just directed at Richter. It was shared. As Marrow assembled the timeline, he felt the familiar tightening. The case was coherent now, but coherence did not guarantee consequence. The men who did this did not rely on anonymity alone. They relied on structure, on the way responsibility dissolved as it moved upward. Richter had been beaten to death because he introduced friction, because he paused long enough to look, because he believed that knowing something dangerous could keep him alive. Marrow pinned the last photo from Richter's phone to the board. The chalk mark on the warehouse floor, half erased even in the image, still visible enough to suggest order, inventory, counting, movement. Whatever Richter had seen was already gone. Only the response remained, and the response had been precise, violent, and final. The investigation continued, but its direction was now clear. It would not end with the men who swung the block. It would end, if it ended at all, where silence was enforced long before fists were raised. The first arrest did not come with satisfaction. It came quietly, wrapped in paperwork and reduced expectations. Detective Paul Marrow brought in the man who had been driving the black SUV, a low-level enforcer named Lucas Grant, whose criminal history consisted mostly of intimidation charges that never stuck. Grant did not deny being present. He did not deny restraint. What he denied was agency. He described his role as supervision, rather than participation, a distinction that mattered deeply to him. Grant explained that Evan Richter had been flagged weeks before the beating, not because of theft or exposure, but because he had stopped moving when told to move. Richter had asked for meetings instead of instructions. He had asked for assurances instead of payment. He had taken photographs. Those behaviors triggered review. The meeting at the grocery store was framed to Richter as a conversation. Grant said Richter arrived hopeful, believing he could negotiate terms or trade silence for money. The first blows were meant to reassert hierarchy. The restraints were meant to slow him down. When Richter continued to argue, continued to believe words mattered, the decision was made to escalate. Grant said the cinder block was chosen because it ended things without requiring proximity. He described the moment clinically, as if recalling a work procedure rather than a killing. Marrow understood then that the violence had not spiraled. It had progressed. Grant was charged with kidnapping and aggravated assault. Murder charges were discussed and deferred. Grant's cooperation was considered valuable, though it produced no names above him. The structure protected itself as designed. Search warrants were executed at the appliance warehouse and 3 related properties. Nothing was found. Floors were bare. Walls were scrubbed. Power connections had been removed cleanly. The chalk markings Richter photographed were gone, along with any trace that they had ever existed. The holding company dissolved 2 weeks later. Evan Richter's death became the only visible casualty. Marrow visited Richter's sister once, after the press stopped calling. She lived outside Sparks, worked 2 jobs, and spoke carefully, as if choosing words mattered, even now. She said Evan had always believed he could fix things by understanding them. He liked knowing how systems worked. It made him feel safe. Marrow did not correct her. In his final report, he wrote plainly, Richter had been abducted, restrained, beaten, and killed by multiple assailants. The motive was retaliation for perceived non-compliance. The case was technically open, but operationally complete. No one argued. Months later, the strip mall was sold. A fence went up. A sign announced future redevelopment. The grocery store interior was demolished, its concrete hauled away in pieces too small to recognize. The cinder block was never recovered. Merrill drove past the site one last time on his way out of Reno. The lot was empty, quiet, unremarkable. There was nothing to suggest that a man had been brought there alive and left broken. Evan Richter had not been killed because he was dangerous. He had been killed because he believed attention could be managed, because he believed he could pause a system built entirely around motion. The violence that ended him was not emotional, it was instructional. And somewhere beyond the strip mall, beyond the warehouses and shell companies and borrowed buildings, the lesson continued to move, carried forward by people who understood exactly what it had cost to teach it. Richter had learned it too late, but thoroughly. Now, let's jump into a new story. The receipt was printed at 2:14 a.m., curled slightly at the edges where the heat had dried the paper too fast. It listed 3 items, all common, all legal to sell, all paid for in cash. The clerk at the pawn shop did not remember the face attached to the transaction, only the hands. They were clean, steady, and careful not to touch anything unnecessary. By the time the shop opened again at 9, the receipt had already become important. The town of Riverbend, Indiana, sat low against the water, a place shaped by crossings rather than destinations. The river cut it in half, and most people crossed the bridge without thinking about the current below. The nights were quiet, not because nothing happened, but because whatever did happen usually stayed contained. People locked their doors more out of habit than fear. That sense of containment broke. Just before dawn, a jogger crossing the bridge noticed something caught in the reeds near the bank. At first, it looked like driftwood, then clothing. The jogger slowed, then stopped, then called it in with hands that shook from the cold and from the sudden awareness that the morning had changed. The body belonged to Thomas Hale. Hale was 56, a local figure in the way small towns define importance. He owned a regional shipping company that ran trucks through 3 states. He sat on the school board. He donated to flood relief and sponsored a Little League team. His name appeared often in the local paper, usually paired with words like reliable and steady. He was also very dead. The river had not been kind. It pulled at him, pressed him against stone, filled his pockets with silt. But the cause of death was not drowning. The medical examiner would later determine that within the hour, but even at the scene, it was clear that Hale had been injured before he entered the water. His coat was torn. His knuckles were split. There was bruising along his arms that suggested restraint rather than impact. There was no wallet. Detective Mark Ellison arrived as the sky lightened from black to gray. He stood back from the bank, letting the technicians work, watching the way the town gathered at the edges of the tape. Riverbend did not have many homicides. When it did, people came to see them, not out of cruelty, but out of a need to understand how something like this could fit into their lives. Ellison knew Hale slightly, the way one knew people who attended the same meetings year after year. He remembered Hale as polite and guarded, a man who spoke carefully and listened more than he revealed. That memory did not align easily with the violence in front of him. The bridge camera showed Hale's truck pulling onto the shoulder at 11:38 p.m. the night before. The footage was grainy, the angles imperfect. Hale exited the vehicle alone. He walked toward the river, not hurried, not forced. After that, the cameras caught nothing useful. The blind spots did what blind spots always did. Hale's phone was not recovered. His keys were found in the truck, placed in the cup holder rather than dropped. That detail mattered to Ellison. People under stress did not usually take the time to set things down neatly. By midday, the town had filled in the blanks with rumor. Some suggested robbery. Others suggested a business dispute. A few whispered about personal secrets, about money, about the quiet spaces behind public generosity. None of it was grounded in fact. It was simply the town trying to restore a sense of order by explaining away disorder. Ellison preferred to start smaller. He went to the pawn shop. The shop sat on a side street near the old rail yard, its windows crowded with instruments, tools, and mismatched jewelry. The clerk, a woman named Linda Perez, had worked there long enough to recognize patterns, even when faces blurred. She pulled the receipt from beneath the counter before Ellison finished his question. 3 items: a heavy-duty flashlight, a pair of insulated gloves, a compact utility knife. Purchased in cash. No ID required at that hour. Perez described the buyer as average in every way that mattered. Medium height, medium build, neutral clothing, nothing that caught the eye. The transaction was efficient, almost rehearsed. The buyer declined the bag and carried the items openly, as if they belonged together. Ellison photographed the receipt and left without making promises. Outside, he looked back at the shop, at the way it blended into the street. Places like that existed to serve ordinary needs. They also existed to enable quiet preparation. Hale's home offered fewer answers. His wife, Rebecca, was composed in the way people sometimes were when shock had not yet settled into grief. She answered questions directly. Hale had left the house just after 11, saying he needed to check on something at the yard. This was not unusual. The shipping business ran on odd hours and constant contingencies. Rebecca mentioned a recent strain, but not a conflict. Hale had been distracted, sleeping poorly, reviewing documents late into the night. He had not shared specifics. He rarely did. Ellison noticed the study. The shelves were sparse. The desk clean. Too clean. The computer showed no recent activity, as if someone had made a point of closing everything properly. Again, the order felt intentional. By the end of the day, Ellison had a body, a timeline, and a handful of details that did not sit comfortably together. Hale had gone to the bridge willingly. He had been prepared for something physical. Someone else had been prepared as well. That evening, as the light faded and the river returned to its usual dark calm, Ellison received a call from a patrol officer checking the rail yard. A warehouse door that was normally locked had been found open. Inside, the floor showed signs of recent use. Tire marks, scuffed concrete, a smell that suggested oil and water mixed together. Nothing was missing. Nothing obvious was left behind. Ellison stood at the edge of the warehouse, listening to the distant traffic and the closer sound of the river moving steadily past the town. Whatever had happened to Thomas Hale had not been an accident. It had been planned with enough care to look ordinary until it was too late to ignore. The receipt from the pawn shop sat folded in his pocket, a small piece of paper carrying more weight than it should have. The warehouse smelled like old water and newer decisions. Ellison walked its perimeter slowly, letting the scene settle into something readable. The building had once stored grain, then auto parts, then nothing at all. Its usefulness had faded without ever fully ending, which made it ideal for activities that needed shelter without attention. The tire marks on the concrete floor were fresh, not hours old, but not recent enough to still be damp. They suggested a mid-sized truck, not one of Hale's fleet, but similar in scale. The scuffs near the center of the floor formed a loose pattern, not chaotic, not quite orderly. Something heavy had been moved. Something that resisted. There was no blood. That absence felt intentional. Ellison noted the drainage channel cut into the floor, designed decades earlier to carry runoff toward the river. It explained the smell. It also explained how a space like this could be used briefly, then return to silence without leaving much behind. Back at the station, the case file thickened without becoming clearer. Hale's business records showed no missing shipments, no recent disputes with drivers or clients. His finances were solid. His charitable donations were real. The version of Hale that existed on paper matched the one the town believed in, which only made the violence harder to place. Ellison turned to Hale's last known movements. The bridge camera showed him arriving alone, but it did not show what happened next. A review of traffic footage leading away from the bridge revealed something subtle. A second vehicle passed through the area within minutes, headlights off longer than necessary, moving with caution rather than speed. The license plate was unreadable. The behavior was not illegal. It was deliberate. The pawn shop receipt became the anchor point. The items purchased were practical, not theatrical. The gloves prevented prints. The flashlight allowed controlled visibility. The knife was a tool, not a weapon of excess. Whoever bought them anticipated resistance, but not chaos. Ellison asked himself whether Hale could have been the buyer. The timing worked. The cash worked. But the purpose did not. Hale had no reason to buy those items in the middle of the night, when his own resources were extensive. If he were preparing for something dangerous, he would not have done so publicly, even quietly. The buyer was someone else. Rebecca Hale returned to the station the following morning with a detail she had not mentioned before. Thomas had received a phone call just before he left the house. She had not heard the conversation, only his side, but she remembered the way his posture changed. He had gone still, then nodded once, as if confirming something already understood. After the call, he put on his coat without speaking. Ellison asked about the number. Rebecca did not know it, but she knew where Thomas wrote things down when he did not want to forget them. In a drawer beneath the study desk, Ellison found a folded scrap of paper. It held a phone number and a single word written beneath it. River. The number was a prepaid line, purchased weeks earlier and used sparingly. The call records showed brief connections, none longer than 2 minutes. Hale had not been chatting. He had been receiving instructions. Ellison began to see the shape of it. Hale had been pulled into something gradually, through logistics rather than threat. Shipping companies saw things. They moved goods at odd hours. They understood routes, blind spots, timing. Hale's role on the school board, and his public generosity, provided cover rather than motive. The warehouse fit into that shape too well to be coincidence. It sat close enough to the river for transfer, far enough from residences to avoid casual notice. Its lock had not been broken. Someone with a key had opened it. Ellison reviewed city records. The warehouse had changed hands multiple times, often through shell ownerships that ended quietly. The current owner was listed as an out-of-state holding company that specialized in short-term asset management. The paperwork was clean, but the lack of permanence stood out. This was not a place meant to be invested in. It was a place meant to be used. Divers searched the river again downstream from the warehouse outflow. This time, they found Hale's phone wedged beneath a concrete lip near the bank. It had been damaged deliberately, cracked and submerged, but not smashed beyond recognition. The SIM card was missing. Ellison studied the device in his hands. Hale had not thrown it away in panic. It had been taken, examined, and then discarded. Someone had wanted to know what Hale knew before deciding what to do with him. The medical examiner's report added another layer. Hale's injuries suggested he had been restrained briefly, questioned, then struck with enough force to incapacitate but not immediately kill. The fatal injury came later, likely at the river. This had not been rage. It had been escalation. Ellison considered Hale's choices. He had driven to the bridge willingly. He had stepped out of his truck calmly. That suggested expectation, not surprise. He believed he could manage the situation, or at least survive it. Something had changed after that. A patrol officer reported a new development just after sunset. A truck matching the tire patterns seen in the warehouse had been spotted the night of the murder, entering Riverbend from the south, then leaving less than an hour later. It was registered to a regional rental company. The paperwork showed it had been returned early the next morning, cleaned thoroughly, with no reported issues. Ellison felt the case pulling him away from the familiar geography of the town. Hale's death had not been about Riverbend alone. It had been about what passed through it. As he left the station that night, Ellison stood on the bridge and looked down at the river. It moved the way it always had, carrying things without asking where they belonged. Hale had trusted the systems he worked within, the routes, the schedules, the quiet agreements that kept goods moving and problems contained. Someone else had trusted those same systems to make a man disappear. Ellison knew now that the next answers would not come easily. They would not announce themselves. They would surface only when pressure was applied in the right places, and even then, only partially. The town had lost its sense of containment. What replaced it was something thinner and more fragile, the understanding that violence could arrive, wrapped in familiarity, and leave without explanation. The case was no longer just about how Thomas Hale died. It was about what he had been carrying, and why someone had decided it could not be allowed to reach the other side. Ellison stopped thinking about Thomas Hale as a victim, and began thinking about him as a courier. Not in the literal sense. Hale had not been moving boxes or envelopes himself, but shipping companies moved more than freight. They moved schedules, assumptions, and trust. Hale's trucks crossed state lines daily, with minimal scrutiny, operating inside rhythms so familiar they faded into background noise. That kind of access did not need secrecy to be valuable. It needed reliability. Ellison's first move was quiet. He asked for a full review of Hale Freight's recent routes, not the cargo, but the timing. Late departures, early arrivals, unscheduled stops that fell just inside acceptable margins. Patterns emerged slowly. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic. Just a handful of routes where trucks lingered longer than expected, near river access points or transfer yards that no longer handled much volume. None of the drivers reported anything unusual. That did not surprise Ellison. People noticed what they were trained to notice. If something was framed as routine, it stayed that way. The warehouse near the rail yard began to look less like a crime scene and more like a node, a temporary pause point between movement and disappearance. Ellison returned there with fresh eyes, focusing on what it allowed rather than what it concealed. It offered cover from weather, distance from witnesses, and immediate access to water. It also sat close to two major highways. Someone had chosen it carefully. Ellison requested toll data from surrounding interstates for the night Hale died. It took time, and favors and explanations that remained intentionally vague. When the data arrived, it confirmed what he suspected. A rented truck matching the warehouse tire pattern entered the region from Illinois, stayed less than 90 minutes, then exited north toward Michigan. It did not stop again until nearly 3 hours later. The driver had been invisible by design. Ellison tracked the rental agreement next. The name was real, the license valid, the payment processed through a prepaid card. The signature was practiced. the kind produced by someone who signed documents often but never expected to be remembered. Surveillance footage from the rental location showed a man wearing a baseball cap and a jacket with no markings. His face was partially visible, but unremarkable. Average height. Average build. The same kind of average that dissolved in memory. Ellison pinned the still image to his board anyway. The breakthrough came from Hale's office, not his home. A junior accountant, reviewing records at Ellison's request, flagged an irregularity. Several shipments over the past 6 months had been insured twice. Not illegally, but redundantly, through different carriers, each policy covering a different risk window. It was inefficient and unnecessary, unless the shipment itself was not the primary concern. Ellison realized the insurance was not for loss. It was for delay. If a truck was stopped, rerouted, or held unexpectedly, the paperwork would justify it. Questions would be answered before they were asked. Hale had built flexibility into movement, a buffer against attention. Ellison interviewed Rebecca Hale again, this time with a different focus. He asked about stress rather than fear, about responsibility rather than conflict. She described Thomas as increasingly withdrawn, burdened by something he did not know how to name. He had spoken once about being caught between obligations, about favors that did not feel optional. He had not described threats. He had described expectations. That distinction mattered. Ellison began to suspect that Hale's cooperation had been incremental. A route adjusted here, a delay tolerated there. Each choice small enough to justify, each one building towards something that could no longer be undone without consequence. By the time Hale understood the scale of what he was enabling, exit may not have been possible. The phone calls supported that theory. Short, infrequent, precise. Not the cadence of coercion, but of coordination. Ellison believed Hale had tried to stop. The night he died, Hale had gone to the bridge not to meet a stranger, but to renegotiate terms. The location offered neutrality, visibility, and the illusion of safety. He had not expected violence. He had expected leverage, perhaps the threat of exposure. Something had gone wrong. Ellison shared his theory with the task force assigned quietly to the case. They did not contradict him. They simply reframed it. The movement Hale facilitated, they suggested, was not criminal in isolation. It existed in a gray space where private interests tested boundaries that public systems were slow to define. Hale had become inconvenient when he stopped being compliant. The warehouse, the river, the rented truck, all of it pointed to removal rather than murder. Hale had not needed to die to end his involvement, but his death ensured silence without negotiation. Ellison returned to the pawn shop receipt, still bothering him, despite its lack of direct connection. The items purchased were not specialized, but they were purposeful. He wondered if they had been used at the warehouse rather than the bridge. Gloves to handle Hale, a flashlight to manage the space, a knife, not as a weapon, but as a tool to cut restraints or materials quickly. The receipt placed preparation inside the town, not imported with the truck. Someone local had assisted, even briefly, someone who knew Riverbend well enough to move without attention. Ellison canvassed quietly, not with questions about Hale, but about late-night errands, unusual activity, anything out of place that felt small at the time. It was a slow process. People remembered details only when given permission to consider them important. A night clerk at a gas station mentioned a man buying coffee around 1 in the morning, wearing work boots that were too clean for the hour. He had asked about road conditions near the rail yard, phrasing the question casually, like curiosity. The clerk did not remember his face, only the way he listened. Ellison added that to the board. The shape of the case was nearly complete, but the center remained hollow. He could outline the movement, the planning, the restraint. He could see where Hale fit and where he fell away. What he could not see yet was who decided that Hale's usefulness had ended. As the investigation pressed forward, Ellison felt the narrowing that came before resolution or collapse. The town continued its routines. Trucks crossed the bridge. The river carried on. Somewhere in that motion was the final piece, still moving, still unclaimed, waiting for pressure to force it into view. Ellison found the final piece by stepping away from the board. For weeks, the investigation had moved outward, following trucks, paperwork, shell companies, and insurance clauses that explained everything and nothing at the same time. The answers were technically sufficient, but emotionally hollow. They described a mechanism without identifying the hand that chose to pull it. Ellison returned to Riverbend and stayed there. He spent time in places that did not appear on maps tied to the case. Diners near the highway. Bars that filled just after second shift ended. A bait shop by the river, where men talked more freely about work than about themselves. He listened for resentment rather than confession, for the low-grade anger that settled when people felt used and forgotten. It surfaced in fragments. Hale Freight had downsized quietly over the past year. Routes had been consolidated. Local drivers had been replaced with subcontractors who rotated through without learning names or faces. The decisions made sense on paper. They saved money. They increased efficiency. They also displaced people who had built their lives around predictable work. One name came up more than once: Daniel Price. Price had driven for Hale for nearly 20 years. He lived close to the rail yard. He knew the warehouse well, having used it years earlier for legitimate transfers. He had been laid off 6 months before Hale died, offered a severance package that covered bills but not pride. He took contract work after that, short-term hauling jobs that paid well but required flexibility and discretion. Ellison pulled Price's records. No criminal history, no obvious red flags. But Price's phone records showed brief connections to the same prepaid number that had contacted Hale. The timing overlapped with Hale's final weeks. Ellison did not arrest Price. He visited him. Price's house was small and meticulously kept. The kind of order that came from habit rather than obsession. Price did not deny knowing Hale. He did not deny meeting him the night he died. He did not deny being at the warehouse. What he denied was intent. Price described himself as a facilitator, someone who made introductions, arranged access, smoothed logistics. He had been approached after his layoff by people who framed their work as consulting, efficiency analysis, stress testing. They paid well. They asked for local knowledge, not violence. Price believed them because believing was easier than questioning when money arrived on time. Hale had been part of that arrangement. At first, willingly. Then, reluctantly. The night of the murder, Price said Hale had demanded out. Not gradually. Immediately. He had threatened to go public, to involve regulators, to expose the quiet arrangements that allowed private interests to move through public space without resistance. Hale believed his reputation would protect him. Price had tried to slow him down. The people backing the operation did not negotiate. Price described the moment at the warehouse when the conversation ended. There was no rage, no argument, just a shift. Hale became a liability rather than a partner. Price watched as others stepped in, people he had never met before that night, people whose names he never learned. By the time Hale was taken to the river, Price understood what his role had been all along. Not planner, not enforcer, buffer. Price did not strike Hale. He did not push him into the water. He did not deny that he could have stopped it. His guilt lived in that space. The evidence supported his account. The pawn shop receipt matched Price's movements. The gas station clerk's memory fit his description. The rented truck had been driven by someone else, someone who arrived, acted, and left without imprint. Price was arrested, not for murder, but for conspiracy and facilitation. It was the only charge that held. The people who made the decision remained insulated by distance, legality, and design. Ellison testified later, carefully and without embellishment. The case closed not with a verdict that satisfied the town, but with one that fit the limits of proof. Thomas Hale's death was ruled a homicide. Responsibility was acknowledged without being fully assigned. Riverbend adjusted the way small towns always did, quietly. The bridge remained open. The warehouse was sealed and eventually demolished. Hale Freight was sold, its name disappearing from trucks and letterhead within months. Ellison visited the river once more before leaving the case behind. The water moved steadily, indifferent to the weight it had carried. The surface reflected the sky, calm and unbroken, giving nothing back. Thomas Hale had believed he could step into the machinery of quiet arrangements and step back out when it no longer suited him. He had believed that reputation and reason were enough. The system he encountered had been built to move forward, not to stop. And when it reached the point where a man became an obstacle, it did what it had been designed to do. It removed him and continued on.